Welcome to the Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associates Interview Series on radio and podcast. The show covering all things health, wellness, culture, and more. The show for all of us who aren't old, we're better. Each week, we'll interview superstars, experts, and ordinary people doing extraordinary things, all related to this wonderful experience of getting better, not just older. Now, here's your host, the award-winning Paul Vogelzang.
Welcome to another enlightening program with our Smithsonian Associates Interview Series. I'm Paul Vogelzang, and today we are honored on Memorial Day to host Harry Yeide, a distinguished national security affairs analyst and a respected author in the field of military history with 27 years of experience as a federal government analyst. Mr. Harry Yeide, Smithsonian Associate, brings a wealth of knowledge and insight into the geopolitical intricacies that have shaped our world. Harry Yeide's Smithsonian Associates presentation titled The Axis Powers and the Buildup to World War II promises to be a captivating exploration of the strategic decisions and miscalculations that led to one of the most significant conflicts in modern history. Drawing from original documents and first-hand accounts from German, Japanese, and Italian sources, Harry Yeide will provide a unique perspective on the Axis powers' underestimation of America's industrial might and strategic capabilities. With us today, Harry Yeide from Smithsonian Associates will delve into the fateful attack on Pearl Harbor, explaining how Japan's attempt to protect its flank from the U.S. Navy set the stage for a colossal confrontation. Additionally, we will explore the early views of Hitler's high command, their lack of intelligence on American war policy, and the pivotal moments when Axis leaders realized that the United States and its allies were on a path to victory. Harry Yeide will be appearing at Smithsonian Associates coming up. The title of his upcoming presentation is The Axis Powers and the Buildup to World War II. You'll find all of this information in our show notes today. Please join me in welcoming Smithsonian Associate Harry Yeide.
Hello, my name is Harry Yeide, and I'm going to be talking to you today about some of the key conclusions from my new book, Betting Against America. I'm a retired federal intelligence officer, and I'm going to read a section of the book that pretty much summarizes the key points of the volume. Japan and Germany went to war against America, betting that they could win before the United States could do very much about it. Japan, after viewing the United States as a future enemy since 1907, reached its decision through a sophisticated process of open internal debate and a strategic assessment. The assessment included analysis of American intentions and capabilities, Japan's ongoing war in China, the expected military outcome in Europe, and careful consideration of Japanese access to strategic raw materials. Given what the Japanese knew, could reasonably have guessed, and could not have known about the United States, the decision was a calculated risk, but one more like a high-end financial gambit than gambling with the dice at the craps table. This is not the first work to argue the case for calculated risk rather than national suicide, but it will establish that the decision for war occurred by late 1940 and will document, to the extent possible, Japanese thinking leading up to the decision at that time. The key point is that Japan went to war with America over China. It had a plan that it thought would stalemate America and leave it in possession of its conquests. Germany, which is to say Adolf Hitler, considered the United States until 1941 as an afterthought, a naval power to be sure, but one unlikely to play any role in Europe beyond supplying France and Great Britain with raw materials and weapons. Hitler in April 1941 crossed the psychological line of saying Germany would enter a Japanese-American war. He and his henchmen made a bet like drunks at the racetrack. The German high command had conducted no appraisal of American military intentions and capabilities as of April, nor by the day Hitler declared war on 11 December. Hitler had no plan and admitted in early January 1942 that he had no idea how to defeat America. Italian leaders had a fairly accurate view of the implications for the axis of war against America. All bad, though it seems to have been based more on reasoning than any deep assessment of factual information. They had little choice, though, but to bet on Hitler's horse.
Harry Yeide, thanks for joining us today. Welcome to the program and happy Memorial Day to you and yours.
A happy Memorial Day. And I would like to offer my thanks to all the American men and women who paid the ultimate sacrifice to defend my freedoms and my democracy.
Well put. Thank you, Harry, very much. I appreciate those words. And thank you for a wonderful book, Betting Against America. We're going to get into that today. You've shared it with me. Congratulations on the book and all of this work. Why don't we start? Tell us briefly about what you're going to be telling us at your upcoming Smithsonian Associates presentation. I think that's going to be fascinating. You'll talk a lot about the book and this subject, which we'll get into, but a little groundwork for us.
The event will be June 13th in the evening, and it will cover the ground that I just covered in the reading, but in a lot greater detail. And I will be using visuals that will help the audience track some of this, some period photos that will make some of these Axis leaders come to life. Everybody knows Hitler and Mussolini. Many know Tojo, who was the propaganda face of Japan, but he wasn't really running the show until October of 1941 and was ousted in summer of 1944. I can actually use some data tables to show overwhelming American production of weaponry and some other interesting things.
I think it'll be very interesting. And I so enjoyed the book and the photos and all of your research. I just can't say enough about all the great work that you've done. Again, congratulations, because I think the research is amazing. You mentioned that you're a former national security analyst, having worked with agencies within our U.S. federal government. How did that help you in researching the book, Betting Against America?
That's a good question. When you're an intelligence officer, you look at the world through the eyes of your target. I mean, American policy is always the framework. You're trying to help American policymakers achieve their objectives. But your mission is to understand as completely as you can the people at the other end of the chain. What are their motivations? What are their capabilities? What are they likely to do in response to U.S. policy? What are they likely to do even if the United States is paying no attention to them whatsoever? Many events thrust themselves onto the policy agenda as big surprises. So I spent my entire career trying to put my place in the shoes of somebody in the Balkans or Latin America or some other part of the world. I also had 2 wonderful years on the Director of Central Intelligence Red Cell, which had as its specific mission to engage in what is often called red teaming, to take the role of a foreign opponent, usually a threat, or you wouldn't be bothering with it, and game out the things that they could do, not just the things that everybody expected them to do, but the things they could do. And that really helped me understand the thought process of the Axis leaders as they sort of stumbled toward war with America.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit, because you do write a great deal about the red team exercise. And so I have a question for you about that. How did this analysis on your part and the research in terms of writing the book, Betting Against America, help you in understanding the perspective of the Axis and their underestimation of America and just their perspective on the war against America?
It helps because I started with the suspicion, especially in the case of Japan, that when you look at most histories of the war, the treatment of Japan starts in 1941, sometimes 1940. Occasionally, a historian will go back to the Japanese invasion of China in 1937. But my experience has said there had to be a whole lot more to it than that. And I tackled Japan as my first research target because I figured that I had to be able to establish a good case using Japanese original sources in order to make the book fly at all. One key source on this was my long gone colleagues in the defense intelligence apparatus, the files of the Army and Navy attachés in Tokyo. which provided a lot of information on Japanese thinking back in the early 20th century. And of course, there was some secondary information as well. And another key source, starting with the war in China, was a history of the Great East Asian War written by a colonel. I'm cheating and looking at his first name, Takashiro Hattori, after the war. And he, as they say in Hamilton, was a guy in the room where it happened. He was on the staff of the Kwangtung Army right after the invasion of China, and then head of the operations section at the Army General Staff through most of the war. So he was super plugged in on all of this. And what I found was that when you start thinking about the question, why did it make sense to Japan to go to war against America? They practiced a long time. I mean, the Japanese Navy picked the U.S. Navy as its potential enemy for budgeting purposes in 1905. In 1907, it picked the U.S. Navy as its only potential enemy for not just budgeting, but fleet construction, doctrine, and so on. So for decades, the Japanese Navy had been preparing itself psychologically to wage a war against America. And over those decades, they planned on what they called a decisive battle, where for whatever reason, the U.S. fleet would come across the Pacific, attrited by Japanese submarines. And when they got close enough to Japan for ground-based air power to come into play, the combined fleet would attack the U.S. fleet and crush it. And one feature would be a major battle between battleships, which the Japanese would win because of bigger guns and superior gunnery and superior elan. They were exercising for this decisive battle through the 1930s. The U.S. Navy was well aware of all of this because of intercepts. And it wasn't until Admiral Yamamoto took over the combined fleet in 1939, the day Hitler invaded Poland, he issued a circular to Japanese Navy officers saying, it looks like there's going to be another world war and we have to be prepared. In any event, he threw out decisive battle and retrained the fleet to fight a carrier-based offensive war. So all of that material was covered in the original source reporting by and large. That's how I got to the point where things start to unfold. They start moving toward war. The key things that happened really do start in 1940. Well, no, the key thing is the invasion of China in 1937. The Japanese had established a doctrine of forward defense in the late 19th century when they modernized militarily. The war chief at the time told the emperor, we can't fight our wars defending Japan against invasions. And Russia was their big worry at the time. We have to have defensive positions outside of Japan where we can fight the Russians instead of here. They took over Korea by 1910. After World War I, they were able to push their forward defense into the Central Pacific because they got the German Mandate Islands, the Carolines, the Marianas, and the Marshall Islands. Then in 1931, they invaded Manchuria. And they picked up other places here and there. So they had a good outlying set of defenses. In 1937, the Japanese leadership, and I want to underscore here the Japanese leadership, because the War Crimes Tribunal basically argues that it was Japanese militarists that dragged Japan in the war and the civilian leadership couldn't do much about it. The civilian leadership was gung-ho pro-war from 1937 on. The prime minister in 1937 was Fumimaro Konoye, who will come back in 1940. And he didn't have the power in Japan's collective leadership to declare mobilization. All policies were worked out through liaison conferences between the various civilian and military departments. Government position would be thrashed out. Then they would go to the emperor and get approval for it. But he was the face of Japan when the Japanese attacked China and he decreed mobilization. Now, this was their first epic error, strategic error. The Japanese, according to Hattori and a British source who talked to senior Japanese officials, they thought they were going to have this short, brief conflict. They thought that in 6 weeks, they were going to slap the Chinese around and that Chiang Kai-shek was going to agree to be Japan's subordinate in its imperial ambitions. The Chinese had planned for a war of attrition, and that's just what the Japanese got. So by 1940, I mentioned Kanoya comes back as prime minister. A new government is formed on 28 July. The Japanese have concluded they can't win the war in China militarily. They come up with two ideas. And I guess I should mention this is when Tojo comes onto the scene as war minister. Okay. The foreign minister at this time, Matsuoka, is the most pro-Nazi, most belligerent person in the entire cabinet. After he visits Hitler in April and May 1942, he keeps lobbying the leadership to attack the British in Singapore. He was trying to get them into the war even earlier. In any event, the new leadership concludes they can't win the war in China. They come up with two ideas. One is a political solution. So they create a puppet government and put out peace feelers to Chiang. And he says, I'm happy to negotiate when you evacuate China. So that went nowhere. And the second idea was, well, we can beat the Chinese army if we cut off all outside support. And that meant that Japan had to invade Burma and Thailand and French Indochina because all the support was coming through there. And if they did that, they realized they'd be at war with Britain and probably with the United States. And that probably would result in the U.S. cutting them off from most of their oil imports, plus all sorts of other things. And that meant that they had to invade the South Seas and take control of the Dutch East Indies, which was rich in petroleum and tin and bauxite and rubber and all sorts of strategic war materials, so they could wage this war. And that meant they had to prevent the Pacific Fleet, which in January 1940 had moved from the West Coast to Pearl Harbor, and which Yamamoto now considered to be his first strike threat. That meant the Imperial Japanese Navy had to find a way to cripple the fleet so it wouldn't sail across the Pacific and attack these massive amphibious operations that were going to be going on to overrun all of Southeast Asia and the South Seas. So Pearl Harbor spills out of their China problem as this Band-Aid solution to prevent America from disrupting that. That is why, in the Japanese context, this made sense. In August and early September 1941, had liaison meetings to generate the policy and so on. And they did take a good look at what they knew about America's ability to mobilize. And they projected aircraft production, ship production, all sorts of things. They went through the process. But the guy from the Economic Bureau who was going to talk about America's dominance industrially decided there was no point. He could tell that the room was headed for war. So he didn't even raise this stuff. When the cabinet on the 3rd of September decided to declare war on the 30th of October, if there was no deal with the U.S., they had this material. And at the council in the imperial presence on the 6th, where it was approved, they also had all this information available. Now, in the event, they wound up delaying the date, as we know, 7 December. But through this, Admiral Nagano, the chief of the Navy staff, general staff, was advocating for action as fast as possible. He had two main concerns. One was Japan right now had a pretty decent balance of forces in the Pacific, and any delay to the coming years with the U.S. expansion would give the Americans a huge superiority. And the second thing was, because of the oil embargo, the fleet was burning through its fuel. And so the Navy really needed to get control of the Dutch East Indies. Tojo was fully on board with this, of course, because the army wanted to fix the China problem. So we get to Pearl Harbor. And Hitler told the Japanese in April that Germany would join the war, but he never issued orders to look at America as an enemy. There is an amazing anecdote in the memoir of the deputy chief of staff of the German High Command, and he recalls his boss calling after Hitler's declared war. And Jodl, his boss, says, well, we'll need an appraisal of what the Americans are going to do now. And he replied, well, considering we haven't been treating them as an enemy, we have no information on which to base such an appraisal. And Jodl says, well, do your best. In the end, the Japanese controlled a source, an American military officer, who gave them the readout from the Anglo-American Arcadia Conference in Washington. Churchill and his war chieftain came came to Washington and they worked out their basic strategy. So early on, the Axis leaders knew that the Allies were planning on a Germany first hold the fort in the Pacific, though in the event, Roosevelt wasn't all on board with the hold the line in the Pacific and pushed and provided the resources for the Americans to start moving already by August 1942 with Guadalcanal.
Hi, it's Paul. Do you love entertaining, informative, eclectic, insightful programs about culture, health, science, life, and everything Smithsonian? As part of our Smithsonian Associates Interview Series on radio and podcast, we're introducing you to the new Smithsonian Associates streaming series. Smithsonian, a nonprofit organization, is excited to present this new aspect of their 55 years as the world's largest museum-based educational program. Join us from the comfort of your home as we periodically interview Smithsonian Associate guest speakers. Our audience here on radio and podcast can explore our website for more information, links, and details at notold-better.com. Thanks, everybody. Our guest today is Smithsonian Associate Harry Yeide, who has written the wonderful new book, Betting Against America, The Axis Powers Views of the United States. Harry Yeide will be appearing at Smithsonian Associates coming up. Please check out our show notes today for more details about his upcoming presentation, his new book, and all of his work. I want to ask you a question, Harry Yeide, about the documents that you were able to study. Again, the research in the book is just phenomenal and is so impressive. And you use this a couple times in our conversation today, this notion that perhaps America was underestimated. What documents did you come across that really bore that out, that just painted a very vivid picture of this underestimation of America and its capability and its willingness to engage?
Some of it is revealed in the documents prior to Pearl Harbor. But the great realization that they had underestimated the United States came as the United States produced all this military equipment for itself and its allies, and demonstrated that it was a very lethal enemy. In the case of Japan, again, we have the records of the meetings where they talked about America's ability to build things, and they were wrong. They got the manpower amount about right, but they just totally underestimated, for example, aircraft production. In the case of Germany, again, it's almost flippant. You see accounts of Hitler and Mussolini talking about the production figures that the United States is releasing on, let's say, tanks, and they laugh at it and describe the numbers as childish. And I think the problem for them was that Germany had gone through this huge military mobilization, and Hitler thought he knew everything about what you could do. And he just couldn't conceive of America having so much more capability to produce military materiel, as well as the underlying raw materials that go into making those things. Through the war, on the Japanese side, you start seeing the realization that they're being overwhelmed, mainly in terms of air power first. I'm going to take just a slight detour here to say sometimes when you're an intelligent analyst, it's the dogs that aren't barking that really matter. In the case of Japan and Germany, there are a few things that they didn't know and they didn't anticipate that were absolutely crucial to the defeat. The first was the fact that their enemies were going to crack their codes and were going to know everything that they did. The Americans cracked the Japanese codes and the British cracked the German Enigma codes. And the Japanese had to transmit everything over thousands of miles. They could not send out a military plan, a convoy schedule, anything that the Americans weren't reading. And it was somewhat less important with the Germans, but it played a role in winning the Battle of the Atlantic. The second thing they didn't take into account was, as I mentioned, the actual ability of the United States to produce things. And the third was none of the Axis powers prepared for strategic air warfare or the bomber campaigns. None of them prepared for it. So the Japanese first experienced the American ability to replenish and supply and replace destroyed things very early in the war. They thought they were going to clean the Americans' clock on Guadalcanal. And American air power there And sea power ultimately left them unable to supply their troops at all. They deployed some of the Army's best divisions there, and they were wiped out. You see Admiral Ugaki, for example, saying, as many aircraft carriers as we destroy, they just build more. And the Japanese problem got worse and worse because in all the naval battles of the Pacific, the Americans knew exactly what the Japanese were going to be doing. Coral Sea, Midway. And from there on, the Americans had their number. And the Japanese lost carriers and lost trained pilots. And they were soon, by 1943, late 1943, they were completely overmatched in the air. On the German side, that realization started to come later. Their first bad experience was when the United States supplied 500 tanks to General Montgomery in Egypt, which he used in the Battle of El Alamein. And the American tanks were early models. They weren't particularly fantastic, but they had the best gun on the battlefield. A lot of Germans admitted that they lost in North Africa in part because of logistics, that the Americans could just supply an endless war. It became most stark for the Germans in Normandy, where the Allies could put so much ashore that, as Rommel put it, German infantry divisions just melted away under American firepower. The Americans were able to sustain logistically and advance all the way across Europe that the Soviets could never have done.
Such a fascinating story. Harry Yeide, I have one final question for you, and it's just my own thinking that you did such a nice job detailing all of the dominoes that needed to fall in order for Japan to bring about their sense of victory and almost world domination, for lack of a better term. The German high command was so busy on large number of actual battlefronts too, that they had a hard time assessing. As a former federal government national security analyst, does this tell us something about today's battles? Is it just too big a project to take on in terms of world domination? And we look at China, we look at Russia, we look at the United States, all poised to perhaps engage, but it seems like we can learn a lot from the history of World War II and get a sense that maybe it isn't such an easy task after all.
Well, I guess world domination, probably. I doubt anybody really thinks of that. But
I don't mean to be.
It's clear that China would like to dominate East Asia. And I do discuss that a bit in the book. The Chinese Navy is similar to Japan's in the sense that it exists solely to fight the U.S. Navy. I mean, that's what it's been built for. That's its purpose.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are a lot of differences. One of them is that China is the world's major industrial power right now. So in that sense, the shoe is on the other foot. But it strikes me that the nature of warfare has changed so much that it's not necessarily determinate if you can build more warships or more tanks or any of that. I truly hope we don't find out.
Agreed. Well, Harry Yeide, thank you so much for your time. Again, congratulations on this wonderful book, Betting Against America. Smithsonian Associate Harry Yeide has been our guest today. We'll be appearing at Smithsonian Associates coming up. Again, happy Memorial Day. Thanks for your thoughts. Thanks for being so generous in reading to us today. We look forward to your upcoming presentation, Harry Yeide, and our audience can find out more by checking out today's show notes. But my best to you, your family, all of yours. And please, as you do more work on this subject, I know our audience is going to be interested in learning more. Please come back.
Okay, likewise. Thank you very much.
My thanks to Smithsonian Associate Harry Yeide for all of his work in this wonderful book titled Betting Against America, The Axis Powers. Harry Yeide will be presenting at Smithsonian Associates coming up. Please check out our show notes for more details on Harry Yeide and his presentation. My thanks to executive producer Sam Henniger for all of his work on our program. My thanks, of course, to the Smithsonian team for their ongoing commitment to our show. My thanks to you, our wonderful audience here on radio and podcast. Please be well, be safe, and let's talk about better. The Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associates Interview Series on radio and podcast. Thanks, everybody. We will see you next week.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Not Old Better Show, Smithsonian Associates Interview Series on radio and podcast. To find out more about all of today's stories or to view our extensive back catalog of previous shows, simply visit notold-better.com. Join us again next time as we deep dive into some of the most fascinating real-life stories from across the world, all focused on this wonderful experience of getting better, not just older. Let's talk about better. The Not Old Better Show.
Hi, one final thing. Please check out our website for this episode and all episodes at notold-better.com or subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, and be sure to check out your local radio stations to find out more about the Not Old Better Show on podcast and radio. You can find us all over social media. Our Twitter feed is Not Old Better, and we're on Instagram at Not Old Better too. The Not Old Better Show is a production of NOBS Studios. I'm Paul Vogelsang, and I hope you'll join me again next time to talk about better. The Not Old Better Show. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next week.